The pain of hip bursitis fades when you correct the touch and reach the right point. Almost no one knows where this point actually is, because for years you've trained your body to respond with protection every time you lie on your side. The hip flares up as if someone had pressed on an invisible wound, forcing you to change positions, stack pillows, wake up in fragments, and accumulate the feeling that your own body refuses to rest. What keeps this pain active is not weakness, age, or bad luck, but an imprecise access that turns the night into a zone of alert and the hip into a locked guardian when it should be stabilizing with ease. You're going to learn exactly what needs to be interrupted to stop aggravating the area, what the single exercise is that reorganizes lateral hip support under load, and how to correct the touch so the nervous system accepts sustaining instead of defending. There's a reason why stretching the glutes and certain movements that seem helpful are actually making the irritation worse, and you're about to understand what that mistake is. If you close this video now, you'll miss the moment when the hip finally understands it can stabilize without friction, and the sharp pain that wakes you in the middle of the night begins to ease because the right point has been accessed for the first time. This access has precise coordinates in the body and works as a command center where the pelvis decides between stability and collapse, between clean support and friction that turns into constant pain. When it's reached inaccurately, the nervous system reads it as a threat and keeps its defenses active even during rest, turning the night into a silent negotiation with your own body. Most people label this as bursitis, an inflammation of the synovial sac between bone and tendon. But the real issue is rarely the bursa itself. The problem is the overload on the lateral gluteal tendons as they pass over the bony prominence of the hip, turning stabilizers into surfaces of friction. In Hermetic traditions and in ancient Egyptian medicine, the hip was understood as the guardian of the axis that unites earth and sky within the body, the place where vertical support and horizontal openness meet. When this guardian loses precision, the entire temple begins to negotiate balance instead of inhabiting it, and the night reveals what was poorly organized during the day. The priests of Thoth understood that the human body carries thresholds where movement and rest alternate, and that forcing these thresholds without wisdom invites rigidity into the structure. What happens in the body is both simple and devastating. The tendons of the gluteus, medius, and minimus cross over a bony prominence on the side of the hip, and when you force collapsed movements, cross your legs repeatedly, hang your weight on one leg with the pelvis shifted, or stretch the glutes when the tissue is already irritated, those tendons begin to work under constant friction. The body registers this as a threat and increases sensitivity in the area. What started as muscular tension becomes tendinopathy, and the pain that was once occasional becomes persistent, especially when you lie on your side, when direct pressure over sensitive tissue triggers the internal alarm. Researchers who study persistent pain and nervous system regulation have found that when discomfort shows up repeatedly during rest, the nervous system begins to interpret the very act of lying down as a risky situation. The body doesn't relax, it negotiates survival, and that negotiation spills into mood, patience, vitality, and creative capacity. You wake up tired not only because sleep was fragmented, but because your entire system spent the night in a state of peripheral protection, keeping the hip on alert as if it were a vulnerable border that had to be constantly guarded. This matters now because you are living inside this cycle. You try to sleep on your side, feel the sharp sting that forces you to shift, accumulate irritation, and slowly lose trust that your body can rest without negotiation. There was someone who went through this so intensely they nearly gave up on sleeping comfortably, until they realized the problem wasn't an inflamed bursa or weak muscles, but a sustained, incorrect touch. Their story will illuminate the path to the practice you're about to receive. Vicky had been supervising a department store for 6 years, coordinating teams, resolving staff conflicts, and spending most of her day walking through aisles and storage areas. At 41, she had learned to ignore the small physical discomforts that came with the job. But what began as an occasional twinge on the side of her right hip slowly turned into something that started to rule her nights. Lying on her side became a silent negotiation with her own body. Every time she tried, the hip would flare up as if the bone were exposed and vulnerable, forcing her to wake up, shift positions, and accumulate layers of irritation that never fully went away. Her attempts to solve the problem followed the expected path. She saw a physical therapist who diagnosed trochanteric bursitis, prescribed glute stretches pulling the crossed leg toward the chest, and taught strengthening exercises done lying on the side, opening and closing the knee against a resistance band. Vicky followed everything with discipline. She applied ice after long shifts, bought orthopedic pillows to reduce lateral pressure, and avoided lying on the painful side as instructed. None of it touched the root of the issue. Instead, she noticed her hip becoming increasingly sensitive, reacting even when she crossed her legs in the break room or stood with her weight shifted onto one side while reviewing spreadsheets. The turning point came from an unexpected place. During a mandatory workplace ergonomics training, the presenter briefly mentioned that many cases diagnosed as hip bursitis are actually lateral gluteal tendinopathies, and that aggressive stretching can worsen tendon irritation when done at the wrong time. Something clicked. Vicky had always felt that she was forcing her body in ways that made the pain worse instead of better. After the session, she approached the presenter and asked directly if there was a different way to deal with the pain, one that didn't involve stretching or conventional strengthening. The answer was clear. Stop aggravating the irritated tissue and reorganize lateral hip support through a single standing exercise that activates the right muscles without friction. Vicky tried the exercise that same night. She placed all her weight on the painful side, bent the opposite knee and opened it outward, then slowly tilted her pelvis as if lifting the hips slightly higher. She held the position for a few seconds before lowering with control. What she felt was completely different from anything she had experienced before. A focused, contained burning sensation on the side of the hip, exactly where the sharp pain usually appeared when she lay down. But this time, her body wasn't reacting with defense. It was activating something that felt forgotten. She repeated the movement 5 times, slowly, paying attention to each phase, and realized that for the first time in months, the hip was being engaged without friction, as if she had finally found the correct way to access a point that had been mishandled for a long time. In the first repetitions, Vicky noticed a slight tremor along the side of the hip. She understood it wasn't weakness, but a sign that the right muscles were finally being recruited, and that her body was responding in a completely different way than it had with stretching or conventional exercises. What Vicky began to feel in that moment is what you're about to experience in your own body now. Following the same access that allowed her to break the cycle of recurring pain and regain the ability to lie on her side without waking up in a state of alert. This access begins by interrupting for behaviors that keep the irritation alive and force the hip to operate in friction when it should be stabilizing. First, stop stretching the glutes by pulling the crossed leg toward the chest, because this movement tensions exactly the tendons that are already sensitive and running over the bony prominence of the hip. Second, stop crossing your legs, whether seated at work or standing in line, because this position maintains constant lateral compression on tissue that needs rest. Third, break the habit of standing with all your weight dumped onto one leg and the hip pushed outward, because this overloads the lateral tendons unevenly and prevents intelligent load distribution. Fourth, abandon exercises like the clam, the movement of opening and closing the knee while lying on your side, because it repeatedly rubs the inflamed area as if polishing an already irritated surface. With the ground cleared, you'll reorganize lateral hip support through a single standing exercise, because the lateral muscles were designed to stabilize the pelvis under vertical load, not to be fixed lying on the floor. Stand upright and shift all your weight onto the leg on the painful side, feeling the entire foot press into the ground as if creating a firm, rooted base. Bend the opposite knee, letting it float freely without tension in the thigh or calf, and place your attention on the side of the hip that is supporting your body. Listen to that area from the inside, not with urgency or expectation, but with quiet precision, as if you were mapping a territory that has never been accessed this way before. The first phase of the movement is to open the bent knee out to the side, tracing a gentle arc through space. As you do this, you'll feel the side of the supporting hip begin to work in a way you may never have experienced before. Don't force the opening beyond what feels natural. Keep the pelvis steady without letting it rotate or tip, and breathe without exaggeration, allowing the exhale to lengthen slightly, as if offering the nervous system a simple signal that there is no danger here. The sensation should be one of localized activation, something waking up in the side of the hip without the sharp sting you're used to. The second phase is the slow pelvic tilt, and this is where the touch is truly corrected. With the knee still open to the side, gently tilt the pelvis in the opposite direction, as if lifting the hip of the free leg a little higher. The movement is subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but internally you'll feel the lateral hip of the standing leg engage with controlled intensity. It's as if something dormant is finally being called back to do the job it was meant to do. The warmth or burning sensation that appears here is not injury. It's a sign that the right tissue is being accessed for the first time in a long while. Hold this position for 2 or 3 seconds, using that pause as a moment of reorganization, a quiet signal to the body that it can sustain without collapsing. The third phase is the controlled descent, and it's just as important as the lift. Slowly undo the pelvic tilt, keeping full control as the pelvis returns to neutral. Then bring the knee back in without rushing. Move as if each phase were being carefully recorded by your nervous system as proof that you can access this area without aggression. The body learns through repetition. When repetition is precise, it learns support. When it's forced, it learns defense. Repeat the full sequence, opening the knee, tilting the pelvis, pausing, and returning with control, until you feel a mild burning or trembling in the side of the hip that's carrying the weight. When that burning or tremor appears, stop immediately. That is your dosage marker, the line that separates reorganization from irritation. You'll do no more than 5 to 8 repetitions until that signal shows up. Then rest for 1 or 2 minutes before repeating the cycle 2 more times. Practice this 3 times a week, always leaving at least 1 day of rest between sessions. Tendon tissue needs time to adapt to new load, and pushing frequency or volume only reinforces the irritation you're trying to resolve. Consistency beats intensity. The body responds far better to a few precise signals than to many disorganized ones. Before moving to the next layer of this practice, there's something essential you need to know about what happened to Vicky after she began applying this access consistently over the following weeks. She followed the exercise 3 times a week, respecting both the dosage and the rest days. Within the first 2 weeks, she noticed that the sharp pain when lying on her side began to appear less often and with less intensity. She could stay on her right side for longer periods before discomfort emerged. And when it did, it felt duller, less aggressive, as if her body was no longer interpreting that position as a direct threat. By the end of the first month, Vicky was waking up only once a night instead of 3 or 4 times. The accumulated irritation had dropped significantly, and she could move through her workday, stand while reviewing spreadsheets, and walk the floor without the lateral sensitivity that used to flare up even during simple actions like crossing her legs or leaning slightly to one side. The most meaningful change wasn't just the reduction of pain. It was the return of trust, the sense that her body could rest without constant negotiation. Vicky began sleeping on her side again without stacking pillows or waking up in alert, searching for a position that hurt less. That shift carried into her days: more patience at work, more presence in conversations with her team, and a clear feeling that vitality was flowing again instead of being trapped in a constant state of deficit. She finally understood that the problem had never been an inflamed bursa or generic muscle weakness, but an incorrect touch sustained over time without her realizing it. Correcting that access gave her hip back its ability to stabilize without friction, and gave her body permission to rest. What Vicky felt over those weeks is exactly what you're beginning to notice now: that controlled, burning sensation on the side of the hip, the sign that the right tissue is being recruited without aggression, and that, with consistency, the nervous system can step out of protection mode and return to support. Now that you've experienced the base movement and felt the lateral hip activate with precision, it's time to deepen the access by adding subtle variations that adjust intensity as your body adapts. If the burning or trembling appears too early, before 5 repetitions, slightly reduce the range of the pelvic tilt. Keep the movement precise and controlled, but don't push recruitment beyond what the tissue can tolerate right now. If the sensation takes longer to appear, or if after 2 or 3 weeks you feel the hip tolerating the load well, gently increase the pelvic tilt, lifting the free side a bit higher and engaging additional fibers of the lateral musculature without losing accuracy. Now bring the breath in more consciously, because breathing here is not decorative. It's a direct signal of physiological safety that supports internal reorganization. During the controlled descent, lengthen the exhale as if you were releasing the air for twice as long as the inhale. Use that extended exhale to lower autonomic reactivity while the hip is working. When the body senses calm, steady breathing, it understands that there is no threat, allowing the hip to accept load without triggering defense, reducing overall tone and increasing tolerance to a movement that once provoked protection. The progression over the weeks follows a simple, measurable logic you can track in your own body. Begin with 3 sets of 5 to 8 repetitions, 3 times per week, and notice at which repetition the burning or trembling appears. In the early weeks, it will usually show up sooner, around the 5th or 6th repetition, signaling that the tissue is still sensitive and adapting to a new type of load. Over time, you'll notice you can reach 7, 8, even 10 repetitions before the sensation appears. That's your objective sign that the tendon is tolerating load more effectively and reorganizing support progressively. When that happens, gradually increase to 8 to 12 repetitions per set, always stopping at the first sign of mild fatigue and always respecting at least 1 full day of rest between sessions. The real timeline for improvement depends directly on the type of irritation you're dealing with, and understanding this clearly prevents frustration and early abandonment. If the issue is primarily muscular tension and overload without deep tendon involvement, improvement can happen within days or a few weeks, because muscle tissue responds quickly when load is corrected. If it's an established tendinopathy, with recurring sensitivity, chronic irritation, and a history of pain when lying on your side, improvement usually begins between 3 and 6 weeks and continues to build over months. Tendon tissue adapts more slowly than muscle and needs time to reorganize its structure without being forced. That's why consistency matters more than intensity, and why you need to stay with the practice without demanding immediate results your body is not yet ready to deliver. The core practice is now complete, and what comes next is sealing this reorganization so it becomes a stable pattern rather than a temporary experience. The physical marker that confirms real change is simple and easy to track. The side of the hip that once reacted with sharp pain to the slightest contact now responds with controlled warmth during the exercise and then gradually softens afterward. That shift tells you the tissue is accepting load instead of defending against it. When you finish the practice, stand still for a few seconds and notice how the hip you worked feels more present, more grounded, as if it has rejoined the structure instead of operating in isolation. That sensation is the sign that the sacred point was accessed with precision, and that your body registered the difference between being forced and being reorganized. To anchor this new state and turn it into something you can return to at any time, use the following gesture. Place your hand gently on the side of the hip where you felt the burning during the exercise. Then make a small pelvic tilt for 30 to 60 seconds, the same subtle lift you practiced before, while breathing slowly with a longer exhale. This gesture is discreet enough to use anywhere, whether you're standing in line, taking a break at work, or preparing to lie down. It works as a somatic reminder that your hip knows how to support when it's accessed correctly. If the sharp sensation returns when you lie on your side in the coming days or weeks, don't panic and don't interpret it as failure. Go back to the 4 interruptions that clear the ground. Return to the standing exercise with a reduced dose, starting with just 2 sets of 5 repetitions. As you move, repeat internally. The hip supports, I allow rest. This return protocol turns the practice into a long-term tool, because a body that is relearning support after years of compensation may have occasional flare-ups. That doesn't mean progress was lost. It means the system is recalibrating and needs a reminder of the correct access. The seal is now complete. What you experienced here doesn't end when the video does. It continues every time you choose to correct the touch instead of forcing, every time you respect dosage instead of pushing, and every time you allow the body to reorganize instead of demanding obedience without awareness. That choice unfolds in subtle but measurable ways. The side of the hip that once flared with sharp pain now responds with controlled activation and then softens. The night stops being a zone of alert and becomes a place where rest happens without fragmentation. And you begin to notice that hip bursitis pain fades, not because it was fought, but because the sacred point was finally accessed correctly. The hip returns to its role as a guardian of stability instead of a surface of friction. And that change writes itself into the tissue before it ever becomes a conscious thought. This practice you've just experienced is part of something larger, a path of reconnection with areas of the body that lost precision of access over time, and that, when restored, return presence, vitality, and the ability to sustain creation without internal fragmentation. The hip is only one of the thresholds where stability and friction are decided. There are other regions of the body that operate under the same logic, waiting for you to learn how to access them without force, with somatic intelligence that respects the deep wisdom of the structure. Jill Cook, A researcher who dedicated decades to the study of tendinopathy once said, "Tendons don't fail because they are weak. They fail because load is distributed poorly over time." What you did here was redistribute load intelligently, teaching the hip that it can stabilize without living in constant friction. That reorganization happens first in the tissue, long before it becomes a conscious understanding. When you correct the touch and access the sacred point with precision, you are not just adjusting biomechanics. You are restoring the original intelligence, that source inscribed into the body, where every tendon, every muscle, every joint knows exactly what to do when accessed correctly. The body was not created to live in permanent defense, but to sustain presence, movement, and rest with natural fluidity. And when you learn to correct imprecise access, you return the temple to its original function. If this content resonated with you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications. That simple gesture supports the continuity of this work and allows more people to access knowledge that unites science, the body, and ancestral wisdom in a practical, grounded way. Share this with someone you know who lives with hip bursitis, pain, and feels stuck in a cycle of stretches and exercises that never address the root of the problem. Consider becoming a channel member to support the creation of more content at this depth and help this work reach those who need it. I'd like to know how your hip responded to the correct access and what changed in your ability to lie on your side without waking in alert. Leave a comment saying, "I correct the touch, and the bursitis in my hip fades away." These words anchor the experience in the body and in awareness, reinforcing the reorganization you just initiated. If you want to continue exploring this path of somatic reorganization, click the video appearing on the screen now. Hip bursitis pain fades when you finally correct the touch, and what once showed up as recurring sharp pain becomes a distant memory, because the body has learned the difference between being forced to obey and being guided to reorganize, between access that harms and access that truly liberates.